again. This time we are gonna hear Mr. Pineda with his presentation, which is Stoic metaphysical disjunctivism. Go ahead. Thank you very much. Here.
So first of all, I want to thank Professor Ricardo for inviting me to participate here. Basically, what I'm going to present today is for some working hypotheses. I work mostly on Stoic epistemology. So what I'm trying to do now is like discuss some ontological questions that underline or are connected in some way with faithful to single causal account of perceptual representation, Chrysippus's response marks a significant advancement in this framework. More specifically, he introduced a twofold distinction that points to a view on the nature of perceptual representation that aligns with contemporary metaphysical disjunctivism. My primary evidence for Chrysippus's response is a testimony from Aetius. This testimony credits Chrysippus with introducing twofold distinction. First, he distinguished between two kinds of soul affections, representation and imagination. Second, he distinguished between the intentional object of this soul affection, represented object as the object of representation and pigment as the object of imagination. I would argue that Chrysippus introduced this twofold distinction to solve the ontological problem of the object of perception, offering a solution that overcomes the shortcomings of its predecessor. To place my proposal with the broader scholarly debate, let us make two remarks. First, the philosophical problem that Chrysippus aimed to address, as well as the precise meaning of its twofold distinction, is a subject of scholarly debate. Some scholars seem to dismiss the philosophical relevance of the distinctions. Others contend that this distinction addresses the academic's skeptical challenges to the system of Stoic epistemology, the cognitive representation. Instead, I will argue that Chrysippus' twofold distinction was a response to the ontological problem of the object of perception. Second, some scholars have noted the similarities between Chrysippus' twofold distinction and contemporary varieties of ontology. I side with those who hold that this distinction is more accurately characterized as a metaphysical distinction akin to contemporary metaphysical disjunctivism. According to them, representations and imaginations are fundamentally different kinds of soul affection because of significant difference in their metaphysical features. However, my interpretation of Chrysippus's metaphysical disjunctivism highlights certain elements that are often neglected due to its association with the challenges of the academics. This paper is structured as follows. First, I present Zeno's causal account of representation and Cleanthes' interpretation of this account. In doing so, I aim to outline the views of Chrysippus' predecessor regarding the ontological status of the object of perception. Second, I examine how Sextus Empiricus and the Cyrenaics engage with the ontological problem of the object of perception. In doing so, I'll lay out some challenges that Chrysippus must address in his response to this problem. Third, I argue that Chrysippus' response lies in his twofold distinction, which articulates a metaphysical disjunctive view on the nature of perceptual representation. I show that this account is rooted in key tenets of Stoic corporealist ontology that constitute an advancement over his predecessor. I conclude with some final remarks on the epistemological implication of Chrysippus' metaphysical. So first, Zenon's causal account of representation. The assumption that the Stoics adhere to direct realism is somewhat common in Stoic scholarship. The direct realism is the view that the objects of perception are bodily external entities, such as cats, apples, and rocks. Thus, direct realism posits that representation provides us with direct awareness of the external objects that cause them. According to this assumption, the Stoics rejected indirect realism. This opposite view holds that the objects of perception are mental constructs, for example, sense data or mental pictures, that mirror the properties of external objects. In this way, these mental constructs allow us to infer the properties of external objects. Thus, indirect realism posits that our awareness of external objects is indirect, since we are directly aware only of mental constructs serving as intermediaries between our minds and the external world. The assumption that direct realism is the default view finds support in Chrysippus' account. Indeed, his twofold distinction can be seen as an explicit defense of direct realism. However, it is less clear whether Zeno and Cleanthes, the first two heads of the Stoic school, explicitly endorse direct realism as well. In what follows, I aim to shed light on the views of Chrysippus' predecessors regarding the ontological status of the objects of perception. Based on their corporealist ontology, the Stoics argue that the soul is a corporeal entity. More specifically, a subtle body composed of air or fire. The thesis of the corporeality of the soul has important philosophical implications. First, it provides a straightforward solution to the problem of how the body and the soul causally interact. Indeed, the Stoic held that the body and the soul are blended through and through in the constitution of animate beings. This blending enables the soul to receive affection from the body, particularly those produced by bodily external entities interacting with the sense organs. Second, it allows for the characterization of the psychological states in terms of bodily states of the soul. Within this ontological framework, Zeno's characterized representation as an impression in the soul. This definition is based on analogy. Just as heel rings cause impression in glass that the picture shapes, external objects cause representation in the soul that represent the properties. In this analogy, Zeno sought to explain the mechanism through which a representation is able to provide awareness of the external object that causes it. However, Cleanthes and Chrysippus offer different interpretation of the analogy, and therefore different conception of this mechanism. Nevertheless, Zeno's successors agree that representation arises from the causal interaction between external objects and the soul via the senses. Cleanthes offer a literal interpretation of the analogy, conceiving representation as mental pictures that are isomorphic to their causes. This literal interpretation leads to a pictorial conception of representation. In this conception, representation are mental constructs pictorially resembling the external object that caused them. Chrysippus criticized this pictorial conception, arguing that it leads to numerous problems. However, the main problem with conceiving representation as mental pictures mirroring their external causes is that it strongly suggests indirect realism. Thus, Cleanthes might have believed that our awareness of the external world is mediated by our representations, which are the direct objects of perception. Cleanthes appears to hold the representations taken as mental constructs at the entities of which we are aware in perceptual experience. In the Stoic corporealist ontology, these mental constructs are bodies because they are affections of our body. So, as we will see in the next section, this is how Sextus Empiricus understood the Stoic view when he criticized their concept of representation. To avoid this criticism, Chrysippus rejected the pictorial conception of representation, which led to his reassurance of direct realism. Zeno, for his part, does seem to be a clear position on the ontological status of the objects of perception. This is precisely what allows his successors to offer different interpretation of this account. Besides the problem of interpreting this analogy, Zeno's causal account of representation faces another problem. It cannot account for the fact that representation sometimes makes us aware of entities that are not external entities interacting with our senses. In dreams and hallucinations, we are even aware of fictional entities such as Pegasus and the tourist. Since these entities lack causal powers, these cases prove the representation can provide awareness of entities with which there is no causal interaction. Thus, a revised account of representation was needed to accommodate these troublesome cases while remaining consistent with the Stoic corporealist ontology. As I will show, Chrysippus provides a channel. Now, section 2, Hellenistic philosophers on the objects of perception. In this section, I examine how Sextus Empiricus and the Cyrenaics dealt with the ontological problem of the objects of perception. While we will find a considerable overlap in terminology, my aim is not to argue that the Stoics, Cyrenaics, and Pyrrhonians were actively debating one another. Rather, I want to draw attention to challenges that Chrysippus addressed in his response to this problem. While Sextus Empiricus changed the pictorial conception, the Cyrenaics challenged direct realism. Before proceeding, we must know an important caveat. The ontological problem of the objects of perception intertwines with epistemological questions concerning perceptual knowledge. In Hellenistic philosophy, the ontological question is often driven by epistemological concerns. The question of how perception can give us knowledge of the external world leads to the question of what entities we are aware of in perceptual experience. However, it doesn't prevent us from addressing the ontological problem of its own terms, provided that we remain mindful of its epistemological implications. In the conclusion, I will return to the epistemological implication of Chrysippus' response to its ontological problem. Sextus Empiricus' challenge to the pictorial conception of representation. As a Pyrrhonian skeptic, Sextus Empiricus wasn't concerned with positively responding to the question of the ontological status of the objects of perception. Instead, he aimed to exploit the skeptical consequences of the Stoic account of perceptual representations as part of his broader project of debunking any candidate of the criteria. So we have to respond to Sextus Empiricus. And even if the mind does grasp the affection upon the senses, he will not know the external things. For the external things are not like the affection in us, and the representation differs by a long way from what is represented. The representation of fire, for example, from fire. For one burns while the other is not capable of burning. In addition, even if we concede that the external things are like the affection in us, it is absolutely not the case that the mind will know the external things by grasping the affection in us. And in the same way as the person who doesn't know Socrates but is looking at the image of Socrates doesn't know whether Socrates is like the apparent image, so the mind, tending to the affection but not having viewed the external things, will know neither what kind of these things are, nor that they are like the affection. It's true. The representation is the effect of the represented object, and the represented object is the cause of the representation, is capable of imprinting on the sensory power. And the effect is different from the cause that creates it. Hence, seeing the mind passes on the representation, it will grasp the effects of the represented objects, but not the external represented objects. And if someone were to say that it fastens on the external things might mean by means of the effect that happen in it, we will bring in the impasses mentioned above. According to Sextus Empiricus, a representation is a mental construct pictorially resembling the external object that caused it, just like a picture of Socrates resembled the real Socrates. As discussed earlier, the pictorial conception leads to the indirect realist view of the ontological status of the objects of perception. Serving as intermediaries between our minds and the external world, these mental pictures are the direct objects of perception. Based on these observations, Sextus Empiricus deployed a well-known skeptical argument against indirect realism, the so-called veil of perception. The argument asserts that since we are directly aware only of mental constructs, we have no means to determine whether they differ the external cause. Besides the veil of perception, Sextus Empiricus' criticism presents another significant element. This element is the distinction between representations and the external objects, like relata or relation. By this distinction, Sextus Empiricus proved the infeasibility of direct realism with the pictorial conception. According to this conception, we are directly aware only of the causal effects of external objects on the soul of representation, considered as mental constructs resembling the external cause. For this reason, if a representation, the effect, makes us directly aware of external objects, its cause is because they are numerically identical. Thus, since we are not aware of two objects at once, the external object and its mental picture, the mental picture must be the only object we are truly aware of. As seen in the next section, principle of full direct realism by rejecting the pictorial conception of representation. Now, the Cyrenaic challenge to direct realism. The Cyrenaics address the question of the ontological status of the objects of perception by ultimately rejecting direct realism. They contend that our affections don't provide us with direct awareness of the external object that caused them. Their argument for this view parallels the so-called argument from illusion against the dualism. The Cyrenaics say that we are one and we are sweetened. It is possible to say without deceit and truly and firmly unreflected. But that what produces the affection is white or sweet is not possible to assert. For it is probable that one is disposed widely even by a thing that is not white, and that one is sweetened even by a thing that is not sweet. For the person with vertigo or jaundice is activated yellowly by everything, and the person with ophthalmia is reddened, and the person who presses on his eyes is activated as if by two things, and the mad person sees double and imagines the sun double, and in all these cases they are affected in this way is true. But that the thing that activates them is yellow or reddish or double is thought to be false. And so too, it is most reasonable to hold that we are not able to grasp anything more than our affection. For the affection that happens in us reveals to us nothing more than itself. Hence, in fact, if we must tell the truth, only affection appears to us. The external thing that produces the affection is perhaps an existing thing, but it doesn't appear to us. Before considering the argument, we must first explore the meaning of the Cyrenaic terminology. Unlike the Stoics and Sextus Empiricus, the Cyrenaics didn't employ the term representation when referring to affections caused by external objects interacted with our senses. Instead, they used the term affection. Moreover, they characterize these affections through verbal and nonverbal expressions such as being reddened, being disposed widely, or being activated yellowly. As it will suggest, this might show a different understanding of the metaphysical structure of perceptual experience. The Cyrenaic argument begins with cases of perceptual illusions. In these cases, external objects appear to our awareness differently than they truly are. For instance, a person suffering from ophthalmia perceives external objects as red, even though they are not red in reality. In these cases, the argument points out that it supposed that the external object possesses the properties. The external objects possess the properties presented in our affections. Consequently, these properties must be inherent in the affections themselves rather than in the external objects. From here, the argument makes a generalizing inference. What is true of illusion must be true of all affections. Even when affections are believed to represent external objects accurately, we are only aware of the properties inherent in the affection themselves. Thus, the Cyrenites conclude that it is most reasonable to hold that our affections makes us directly aware, revealed in the terminology, only of themselves and not the external object that cause them. The Cyrenite argument against direct realism seems to rely on the implicit assumption that all our affections belong to a common genus. This assumption underlies the generalizing inference, since all affections share a common genus, a unified account is warranted. Thus, the existence of illusions, affection that makes us aware of properties that are not present in the external object that cause them, leads to the conclusion that all affections makes us aware of properties present only in the affection themselves. However, this assumption is not unreasonable, as the subjective indistinguishability of illusion and accurate affections provides phenomenological evidence for their common genus. For this reason, the explicit rejection of the common genus assumption is a key part of Chrysippus' defense of direct realism. To conclude this second section, let us examine the Cyrenites' view on the ontological status of the entities that appear to award in universal experience. At first glance, their view appears to be a form of indirect realism. We are aware only of the affections themselves, which are mental constructs resembling the external object that cause them. However, their way of characterizing affections indicates a different conception of the metaphysical structure of perception. According to the Cyrenites, affections don't provide awareness of any entity, whether external or internal. Thus, the properties that appear to awareness are not attributes to any entity, but they are intrinsic to how we are affected. Rather than reifying affections, the Cyrenites limited to our awareness to the properties of our own subjective experience of being affected in a particular way. So, let's move then to the section 3, Chrysippus' disjunctivism. I have anticipated that Chrysippus' position on the ontological status of the objects of perception aligns with direct realism. More precisely, he held that the entities that appear to our awareness during perceptual experience are the external objects that cause them. Since these entities are bodies, they can causally affect the soul in a way that enables us to be directly aware of them. Although some consider this to be a standard Stoic view, Leonardo's pictorial conception of representation suggests otherwise. In this section, I will show that Chrysippus offers the first explicit defense of direct realism as a response to the problem of the objects of perception. In doing so, he responds to the challenge posed by the position of Sextus Empiricus and the Cyrenites, avoiding the shortcomings of his predecessors. So first, the lie metaphor against the pictorial conception. Chrysippus criticized Cleanthes' literal interpretation of Zeno's was analogy. This literal interpretation leads to a pictorial conception of representation. In this conception, representations are mental constructs pictorially resembling the external object that cause. This conception is problematic because it leads to an indirect realist view of the ontological status of the objects of perception. As Sextus Empiricus argued, indirect realism has skeptical consequences regarding our knowledge of the external world, since we are directly aware only of mental constructs. We have no means to determine whether they depict their external cause accurately. Moreover, any attempt to avoid the skeptical consequences within this framework results in the absurd identification of an effect we discuss. To avoid these consequences, Chrysippus offered an alternative interpretation of the synopsis was knowledge. In this non-literal interpretation, Chrysippus argues that representation is alteration of the soul, just as an impression is an alteration of the West block. This interpretation remains faithful to Zeno's causal Lacan representations, positing that such alteration arises from the causal influence of external objects on the soul. However, it rules out Leonardo's pictorial conception of representation. Since alterations are not mental pictures, Chrysippus proposes a different conception of the mechanism through which representation enables our awareness of the external object that caused them. This different conception avoids indirect realism as an skeptical consequence. To explain Chrysippus' conception of representation, let us turn to our primary evidence of his response to the ontological point of view of this perspective. To this aim, let us first examine the first part of Chrysippus' twofold distinction. So this text 4. Chrysippus said that the following four things are different. Representation is an affection occurring in the soul which reveals itself and its cause. Thus, when through sight we observe something white, the affection is what is engendered in the soul, vision. And this affection enables us to say that there is a white object which activates us. The same applies for touch and smell. The word representation is derived from light, for just as the light reveals itself, whatever it is include this range, so a representation reveals itself and its cause. Represented object is that which produces a representation, for example, something white or tall or everything capable of activating the soul. Following Zeno's causal account of representation, Chrysippus defines representation as soul affections that arise from the causal influence of represented objects on the soul. Represented objects are the bodily external entities that cause the soul affections through the senses. To explain how these soul affections provide awareness of the external object that caused them, Chrysippus proposed the following analogy. Just as the light reveals itself and the objects encounters, representation reveal, that is, provide awareness of both themselves and the external object that caused them. This analogy, representations are not mental constructs pictorially resembling the external cause, but mental state they enable the direct awareness of the bodily external entity that caused them. The claim that representation also enables the awareness of themselves indicates that they are conscious mental states. Thus, when we are aware of external objects, we are also aware of our soul undergoing the causal influence of this object. Chrysippus adopted then an enabled conception of representation. This conception maintains that representation are enablers of our direct awareness of the external object of external work, rather than intermediaries of our indirect awareness of it. This conception leads to a direct realism, as the entities that lead to awareness when we experience a representation are the external objects that cause the represented objects. In this way, Chrysippus avoided the skeptical consequences of the pictorial conception of representation. Since representations are not mental pictures and external objects are directly present to our awareness, we don't need to determine whether our representation reflects the external cause. As Thesis Empiricus argued, any attempt to defend direct realism within the pictorial framework results in the absurd identification of an effect with its cause. Chrysippus' enabled conception of representation also avoided this criticism. In this conception, a representation is a distinct kind of effect, one that enables the direct awareness of its cause. The representation provides direct awareness of both themselves and their cause doesn't mean that we are directly aware of two objects at once. The external object, the cause, and the mental picture to the text. Rather, it means that we are aware of experiencing a soul affection, making us directly aware of only one thing, the external object. From this viewpoint, the main problem with the pictorial conception is that it conflates the entity of which we are aware, the intentional object, and the soul affection, the mental state. That enables this awareness. Chrysippus drew this difference clearly. So, as observed, Chrysippus' enabled conceptual representation is a defense of the realism. However, we still need to examine how it dealt with the synchronized argument against direct realism. We also need to examine how it accounts for the soul affection that makes us aware of entities that are not bodily external entities interacting with our senses. To explain Chrysippus' response to these two challenges, let us focus now on the second part of his distinction. So the disjunctive argumentative strategy. Let us begin with the rest of Aetius' testimony. Imagination is an empty attraction, an affection in the soul which arises from no represented object. And when someone fights with shadows and splits his hands against the earth, where representation has some underlying represented object, but imagination has not. Pigment is that to which we are attracted in the empty attraction of imagination. It occurs in people who are melancholy and mad. At any rate, when Orestes in the tragedy says, "Mother, I beg you, don't send to commit those bloody-looking snake-shaped girls. They are attacking me." He says this as a madman. He sees nothing but the only thing that he does. Chrysippus' twofold distinction identifies two fundamental different kinds of self-affection: representation and imagination. The fundamental differences between these these affections are: one, their causal history or etiology, and two, the ontological status of entities they make us aware of. Chrysippus' twofold distinction is based on key tenets of Stoic ontology, of Stoic corporealist ontology, as we can observe. Let us examine these two differences in detail. As discussed above, representations are soul affections caused by bodily external entities. These entities, the represented objects, are the entities of which we are aware in representation. Thus, representation have the particularity of providing direct awareness of their cause. In other words, the cause and the intentional object of representations are numerically identical. In contrast, imagination arises without the causal influence of external objects on the soul via the senses. The soul itself is the cause of its affections. As a body, the soul possesses the causal power to produce affection within itself. The following text discusses the causal history of imagination. We will find that not even the so-called false representations, for example, those in Slee and those in Magnus, are distinct from the things known to us to sense perception by way of experience. Indeed, the person who Magnus imagines foolish, bloody-looking, dragon-shaped girls, conceives a shape put together out of the things that have appeared to him. In the same way, the person who dreams in his sleep of a winged man doesn't have this dream without having seen something winged and a human being. And generally, it's impossible to find anything to do with conception that one doesn't have for oneself as something known by way of experience. In an empirist vein, the Stoics held that imagination had their causal origin in perceptual representation of bodily external entities. The soul can manipulate the content of prior representation stored in memory. In doing so, the soul can produce affections, that is imagination, within itself that provide awareness of feelings. For instance, the imagination of a fury, a mythological creature, arises from the soul's manipulation of previous representations caused by girls, make some blood. The ontological status of pigments is a matter of debate, especially whether they belong to the Stoic superingenious or something. Despite this, pigments are clearly mental, non-existent entities, regardless of whether their mental dependence qualifies as something. As such, pigments lack causal powers and therefore cannot cause imagination. As stated above, the soul itself causes imagination. Thus, imagination provides awareness of entities that are not your thought. In live representation, the cause and the intentional object of our imagination are numerically distinct. So far, we have seen the metaphysical differences between representation and imagination. These differences are substantial enough to warrant their classification into two separate genera. Thus, representation and imagination are sole affections of two different kinds because of their different causal histories and the different ontological status of the intentional objects. Thus, this distinction yields a disjunctive view of perceptual experience. This view provides a causal account of representation that makes room for imagination while remaining consistent with Stoic corporealist ontology. Furthermore, Chrysippus' metaphysical disjunctivism defends direct realism against the Cyrenaic challenge. As noted above, the Cyrenaic argument rests on the common genus assumption. This assumption allows them to draw conclusions about all perceptual experience, affections in the terminology, by analyzing their defective cases, such as illusion. Chrysippus' metaphysical disjunctivism rejects this assumption, since he analyzes affection as disjunctively divided into two different genera. This prevents us from drawing conclusions about the nature of representation from the nature of imagination. Thus, the fact that imagination provides awareness of mental constructs doesn't imply that the representation also provides awareness of such entities. Provided that they have the causal history, affection provides direct awareness of the bodily external entity that's caused. So, final remarks, epistemological implication. In the absence of explicit evidence regarding his philosophical context, I posit that Chrysippus' twofold distinction was a response to the ontological problem of the abuse of perception. This problem centers on the question, what is the ontological status of the entities that lead to awareness during perceptual experience? Chrysippus adhered to a direct realist view on this question, maintaining that these entities are corporeal external entities. Given the challenges facing this view, I argue that Chrysippus introduced his twofold distinction. A last question to consider is whether, as some scholars have proposed, Chrysippus' disjunctivism addresses the academic skeptical challenge to epistemology, specifically the challenge of distinguishing cognitive representation from non-cognitive representations. A primary reason to dismiss this suggestion is that Chrysippus' disjunctivism addresses ontological concerns. It dealt not only with the ontological status of the objects of perception, but also with the metaphysical structure of perception. Furthermore, Chrysippus' disjunctivism is an unsatisfactory response to the challenge. Even if it proves that representations, like a mythic imagination, provide direct awareness of the external object that caused them, the fundamental challenge persists. How can we determine whether we are entertaining a representation of our imagination? How can you tell me soul affections apart? However, Chrysippus' twofold distinction has some epistemological implications that might address the academic skeptical challenge. Let us see the following question. There is one way of rejecting all empty impressions, whether they are informed by imagining, which we have conceived does commonly happen, or when we sleep, or as a consequence of wine or insanity. We must say that that all representation of this kind lack clarity, to which we must stick tooth and nail. For who doesn't perceive when he imagines something and sketches his imagination, as soon as he has stirred and collected himself, what the difference is between a clear and empty representation. According to this text, the Stoic responded to the academic challenge by contending that imaginations lack phenomenological clarity. Introspective reflection reveals a disparity in phenomenological clarity between imagination and cognitive representation. This phenomenal difference can serve as a basis for distinguishing these two sole affections. To conclude, I suggest that Chrysippus' metaphysical disjunctivism grounds this phenomenal disjunctivism in which the phenomenal properties of representations and imaginations differ. In the total history and intentional objects of imagination explain the lack of clarity as products of the soul's manipulation of the stock representations. Imagination lacks the clarity of representations that directly present external objects to our awareness. Moreover, as bodies, these objects are peculiarly qualified individuals. This means that they possess a unique, perceptible, and persistent qualification that distinguish them from any other individual. In contrast, pigments are described as quasi-qualified. This suggests that awareness of pigments may lack the phenomenological richness characteristics of awareness of peculiarly qualified individuals. The process by which imaginations are formed makes it unlikely that pigments could exhibit peculiar qualification to other works. If my suggestion is correct, Chrysippus' twofold distinction might have been a part of a long-ranging strategy. It was not a direct response to the academics. Following Sinus' causal account, Chrysippus made some clarifications about the Stoic concept of representation. In doing so, he focused on the ontological problem of the objects of perception. However, this clarification had epistemological implications that could have been exploited in responding to the academics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this terrific presentation. We have 5 minutes for discussion. Again, I think the easier way is if everyone who wants to ask a question, just hands right now. I will give you a number. Please give your number. So I can cover it. So, question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Number 1? Yes. So,
no problem. A question of general interpretation of your paper, which is we not clear whether you want to do one thing or another. So one thing is this, that you want to show that Chrysippus' position as a criticism of pictorialism, which we interpret as a form of disjunctivism, if that is a position that Chrysippus reached from a reflection that he performed on challenges against the Stoics, no? And in particular, no, you say the challenges posed by Sextus and by the Seguridad. No? So I mean, are you saying that Chrysippus was aware of these criticisms? Well, not of Sextus as such, because Sextus later, but that the objections that appear in Sextus were already available, you know, to Chrysippus, and that he arrived at this position as a result of thinking about his objections and finding a solution. That's one thing. The other thing is different. No? The other way of reading your paper is as follows. That what you want to say is that what is that Chrysippus has theory, anti-pictorialist and disjunctivist, no? And then we can use his theory to address concerns that we find in sectors. No, but I mean, you have no. I mean, you do not claim that Chrysippus was engaged with this objection. So either is fine. I mean, you can say, well, how Chrysippus came to these ideas? I don't know, and it's of no concern for my argument. I just want to show that there is in Chrysippus the elements. There are the elements that we can use to address criticisms with. But I mean, you don't have to provide an account of how Chrysippus reached the position, but you might want to do that. No? So what's your position on this question? And the other question, if I may, is this: is that well, this text 480s, no? Which is the first long 80s passage, no? In which you say that this passage is the main evidence, as far as I can see, that Chrysippus is against order. However, the passage doesn't say that the affection doesn't resemble the external object. No? What the passage says is that the affection is what is engendered by the soul through vision, and this affection enables us to say that there is a white. Yes, of course. So the affection enables us to say, you know, that but this is consistent or compatible with saying that it enables us to do that because it resembles no? So I mean, is there evidence that Chrysippus is against surrealism, or is this evidence? I mean, how is this evidence for?
Regarding the first question, my view is that Chrysippus in some way was aware of those problems. We have interpretation of realities. We have evidence that he criticized the pictorial conception, not in the text that I put here, but in the long text from Sexes and Politics, in which he says that Chrysippus rejected the idea of taking the metaphor literally. Changing the idea is not like an impression of the soul, but more like an alteration. So that's like evidence that he was rejecting the pictorial conception.
Okay.
My idea is that he was aware of those problems as they were presented in Sexus Empiricus and the Cyrenites. But I don't want to, because I think that we don't have a list of evidence that those problems, I mean, that that Chrysippus or any story directly engaging with the Cyrenites. We have no evidence of that, even if we see some shared terminology. But I think that even if that's correct, there are still in Chrysippus an awareness of that this is a problem for this pictorial conception. And in the case of Sextus Empiricus, I also think that he is aware of those problems. We don't know what is the source of sensus empiricus, as far as I know, but I think that he is like reporting some criticism about the concept of representation. So I think that Principal was aware, but I'm not direct evidence of the debate. That's what I want to say, that we have evidence that was a debate, but we have evidence that in Hellenistic philosophy that was a problem. That's the reason why I wanted to discuss this.
Would you say that what you want to say is that it's possible that he was aware, but that we don't have evidence that.
And then seeing the testimony from Elisha, which is the primary source, and trying to look in why he is doing this distinction, why he's trying to solve that. With this and my hypothesis as responding to those problems that are sexes and empiricals and discriminants. And regarding the second question, as I said before, we have the evidence of Chrysippus rejecting the literal interpretation of the method, which tells us that he's rejecting the idea that representation represents by pictorial resemblance. And the mechanism to explain how representation makes us aware of the external objects, I think is better explained with his light analogy. The way the analogy is presented makes us clear that light is not resembling the external objects. They are only make the external objects available to our sight. That's what I think.
Thank you. Thanks, Christian, a lot for representation. I found it very clear. I had one sort of historic question, but it was not covered by the response. So I take the opportunity to make another question. Something that maybe is not directly connected with your objective here, but I think it's both terminological and conceptually relevant, or it may be anyway, which is how are we meant to understand here the phenomenon of awareness? Not so much if the awareness we have of the perceptible object is the thing as it is, or a fictional construct of the mind, but the phenomenon of awareness more in general. In page 11, say describing Chrysippus' position that representations are mental states that enable the direct awareness of the very external entities that cause them. The claim that representations also enable the awareness of themselves indicates that they are conscious mental states. My question is if there is a way to understand the conscious character of mental states or awareness in a more detailed way. Many uses is used precisely because in philosophical world, we kind of immediately know what you mean when you say we have awareness of a perceptible object. But in many cases, when one deals with intentional relations with an object that functions as correlate, you can say, well, in order for that mental state or intentional act of consciousness to instantiate an experience that has a first-person perspective, there must be an intrinsic relation, where consciousness is directed both to the object and also to itself, because otherwise there will not be first-person perspective. That, as example, that happens from Aristotle to Sartre, at least. My question is, if in this context of the discussion,
or Stoicism in general, do we have some sort of internal structure of awareness that explains the mechanism of the phenomenon in general, or not so much? Well, thank you.
There is a passage, a long passage. I don't remember exactly which one, but there are more details about this. But the main point that I want to do here with this idea is showing that in the case of Leonardo's interpretation, it wasn't a clear distinction between the mental state, the conscious mental state, and the intentional object of that mental state. Because the Sextus Empiricus think that if we say that representation, we are aware of the external object, and the representation, there are like two entities that we aware of at the same time. So that's why they say that they are numerically identical. So at least in this part, and of course based on the analogy of light, what it seems to me that is trying to do Chrysippus says, well, one thing is the soul affection. As a soul affection, we are aware of undergoing the affection, but the affection itself reveals the external object at the same time, without never positing two entities or two objects of awareness. I don't know if that helps.
On the side of the object, I understand there should not be a duplication, because otherwise the explanation not that economical. My question, or my interest is rather if do we have some sort of duplication from the side of the act perception, not so much on the side of the object. This typical way of phrasing that Aristotle has, for example, we perceive that we perceive. Well, many times that Victor Caston, for example, explains that in terms of one token act of perception has some intrinsic structure that can be explained in different types of content. So that one type of act and content is the perceptual object, and the other one, which is of a higher level, is directed to the very act of perceiving. I wonder if there is something that explains the awareness or consciousness in this context.
Well, beyond the light metaphor, I'm not quite sure if you can find those sources some more complex.
Right. Thank you very much. Number 3.
Hi. Yes, thank you. But I'm not sure this is useful for your paper. Just out of curiosity, what would be Chrysippus's account of mistakes? I'm thinking, how does this ontological apparatus could be applied to the case of mistakes? Because there is the history of the awareness, the theology part, and I sort of imagine that would be very similar to what happens with hallucinations. But how about the ontological status of the thing that I believe, I perceive? So I'm thinking. So what you say here is that the figment, in the case of hallucinations, the figment is a non-existent entity. But I take it that wouldn't be quite the case with mistakes. So if I think that I saw you, but I'm actually seeing Leonardo. I think that's not quite the same. It's just very simple.
Yes, in that case is, I think it's problematic because it seems to me that it's more like in the epistemological part. I think that the answer of you lies in the Stoic concept of cognitive representation, where they have a story to tell you what impressions, what representation additionally have to fulfill in order to explain those cases. That's why actually your question helped me to make something clear, which is, I think that what's going on here is before of the debate about the cognitive representation. It's a debate regarding their representation. The criticism, for instance, in Cessus Empiricus, the criticism about the concept of fantasia is different, or is on a different moment of his criticism against the cognitive representation. So I think that the answer to those cases is in the part of the cognitive representation. So our representation is not enough to provide knowledge. We also need that representation to be cognitive or catalytic. I think that's a different story regarding what I tell here, right? However, what I have to say about this is, once you have a representation that presents, that make the external object aware, direct to our awareness, there are ways in which there are the problems with the formation of the representation that makes the external object appear differently than they really are. But what I think is that this object in these cases is still the representative object of the affection. Oh, that's not a figment. Not a figment. That's what it is.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really interesting. I shared Ricardo's worry that the ATS passage isn't close enough to get you the not pictorial, but I hear your response to that. But I still wanted to know whether you think that the representations, what you call as the sort of enabling conception representation, is that still representational in a sort of meaningful sense? So it's not pictorially representation, but does it still represent the thing that it's enabling awareness of, or whatever it is? Yeah, I think that's the phrase I use. Because it sounds to me like it kind of has to be, right? So you have this sort of impression that has some kind of content, and what happens is you perceive both that and the object that it's a representation of. And there's another passage, I think, in Plutarch where we did that as well. And like whatever it is that content is, do you think that that's still in some sense representational, even if it's not pictorially so? And if the answer is yes, is that a problem? Like is removing the pictorial representation, is that enough to do the work that you wanted to do, or does it need to not be representation?
Thank you. To be honest, this is a question that I still think, because there are ways to understand this thing. At least, just taking examples in the contemporary philosophy of perception. We have those people who believe that there is no representation. That meant that the perceptual experience are no representation at all. I don't think that this is the Stoic view. I don't think that they are defending something not representational. But I think that I don't have a position about this problem, because I think that both possibilities can be There's no problems in saying that we have no representation, or the other case, we have representation in which, so to speak, the content is object involved in service. So we have like two ways to say that the external object directly appears to awareness without rejecting the idea that there is still a representation. And I think I'm not quite sure yet, but I tend to think that it's more in the line of representation.
Thank you very much. Number 5.
Oh, that's me. Okay, so I wanted to ask you about Cleanthes and the pictorial view. And if I got you right, you take it that Sextus is basically correct about Cleanthes, and that when he presents the veil of appearances or veil of perceptions, you objection to Cleanthes, that is because Cleanthes' view just literally is immediately vulnerable to it, because his view is that what we grasp, first and foremost, is our own pathe. It looks to me that is, I'm not sure I would want to go that far. It seems to me that it's possible that Cleanthes perhaps failed to specify quite a bit of detail in his view, and as a result, Sextus, being up to his usual chicanery, somewhat uncharitably imposes this worry on Cleanthes. So what do you think?
Okay. Actually, I have the same concern. That's what I said in my test, that it might lead to think that this, and that actually that's exactly what I think, that the problem with the pictorial conception itself is that it easily leads to the objection of Sextus Empiricus. And maybe Sextus Empiricus is not thinking that we are aware of a mental construct instead of the external object. It might be the case that we have a representation that is pictorial in some way, puts in direct contact with the external world. But I still think that the fact that he is assuming this pictorial conception is what easily leads to that problem.
I mean, I agree that the way Cleanthes' view is presented by Sextus lends itself to that. But I think it is worthwhile to be a bit cautious about what exactly is going on there. So in Sextus 7:228, what is said is that Cleanthes takes the process in question to be kata, to occur, kata depressions and impressions. That isn't exactly to say that what he actually thinks is that there is an image that we, much less that we are aware of it, that corresponds. Now, it may well be, I mean, it's pretty plausible that he thought there was some kind of correspondence, but the description we get of the view is just it's very minimal. It doesn't really tell us that. I mean, the problems that Chrysippus is described as having, the objections that Chrysippus is described by Sextus as having had against that, can be run without this.
What I have to say about this, I think that you are correct in the sense that this is literal interpretation of impression like cavities and soul might be understood just like, look, our inner structure of representations are some soul affections that resemble it, because without that meaning that we are aware of that, or those things like they were mental images. I agree with that, but again, I still think that it makes it easy for Sextus and to criticize that part. Like, that's what I think. And that's what I think that Chrysippus wanted to avoid this. Not only for the reason that he mentioned, because he mentioned other reasons, but the fact that Chrysippus didn't use the analogy in this other text makes me think that it has some problems, like thinking that representations are in some way isomorphic because so he's trying to get rid of that assumption because it might lead to some problems.
I mean, a lot of this is congenial to what I take to be your ultimate goal. I mean, because it could be, which is, I take it congenial to where you eventually want to go, that Chrysippus didn't as much sort of move completely away from Cleanthes' desperately horrible picture, as much as he deliberately wanted to remove the apparent vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Number 6.
Thanks very much. That's very interesting, Christian. That was really thought-provoking. I want to start off with a suggestion. This is not a criticism, but I think one suggestion I would make would be to not use the translation representation for fantasia, because it creates a lot of misleading implications. So, for example, in T5, when you're talking about imagination, the fantasticon, imagination is an affection in the soul which arises from no represented object, because you're taking fantaston to mean, you're translating that as represented object, because fantasia is representation, and so the fantaston, quite reasonably, you say, is represented object. But that sounds a bit weird, because imaginations in some sense do represent something, you know, they're representing the Furies. So it sounds a bit weird to say that imaginations don't have a represented object. And in general, in the other texts you were talking about too, it seems like the Stoics want to preserve an etymological relationship between fantasia and certain other terms. And so it seems like representation doesn't succeed doesn't go any way towards that goal, whereas maybe appearance or impression might be a bit better. And also, you might think lots of things can be representations without being in the mind. Like a map is a representation, but it's not a fantasia. So I just feel like it's a case where I don't think there's really a strong reason to depart from the more ordinary translation of fantasia as something like appearance or impression. I think that that's a move in the Caston piece that we should all avoid, and that we should leave behind. But another thing I want to say is that that's not a criticism, that's just a suggestion. But I do think it's interesting. A larger question that I had about your piece was, and I think you mentioned it in a footnote, and maybe this is something that maybe I agree with Caston on. I wonder what you think, which is, I think at some points you sort of raised the question of, what's the context of this twofold distinction? Because I think, as you point out correctly, there are lots of cases where not even Chrysippus doesn't use it. Like, because as you were saying in response to this earlier question, it seems like according to the twofold distinction, there can't be a false fantasia. But they routinely talk about false fantasia. So it seems like when they talk about false fantasia, they're not assuming the twofold distinction usage of fantasia. They're assuming, as I think at one point you say, there is a genus of which there's fantasia proper and then imagination. Is that right? And so I guess my question is, what is the context of this twofold distinction? Because another problem might be that no non-perceptual impression, no non-perceptual fantasia. So, fantasia uk aesthetike, that's recorded as one type of fantasia, but it doesn't seem to count as a fantasia according to the twofold distinction, because if you think like 2 + 2 = 4, if you have the fantasia that 2 + 2 = 4, there's no corporeal, or it's not obvious that there's a corporeal object causing you to. So I guess my question is like, in which context is this twofold distinction important? Because it looks like in lots of cases, Chrysippus doesn't really care that much about it. That's my question.
Thank you. Regarding the comment, yes, there is some way why I translated as representation was because I was convinced by Gaston's arguments, basically. But yeah, I'm aware of the wrongness that you have when you translate that with imagination, like not clear the task. So thank you for the suggestion. Regarding the second question, so some people doubt about the philosophical importance of this distinction because this is the only passage in which the distinction is clearly established. In other passages, instead of imaginations, even Chrysippus talks about false representation or empty representation. So what I think that is going on here is that, as usual in Chrysippus, he's not trying to completely reject Zeno's view, but only make some clarifications. Clarify some ideas without changing the complete story. And in doing so, he's relying on a strategy that I see that is common, at least in some texts, which is what's going on, for instance, with the term enoia, which is the genius, but at the same time is a species of enoia together with prolepsis. I think that is going that way, like, okay, Zeno said that's the representation, maybe make some distinction is properly speaking a representation, but we only have something that we call imagination, but we can keep the Zeno's ordinary way, so keep talking about them just as representation. So in that case, that we need to ask, so why he's doing that distinction, and it's very clearly. And the context, I think, is that ultimately what he's trying to do is to defend direct realism. He wants to show that we are directly aware of the external object in order to avoid the skeptical lens that, like those of developed perception. I think that Chrysippus, at the end of the day, that's what he wants. Direct, that objects are directly awareness. The problem with the Sorenai argument that is that if you assume the common genus theory, what you say about imagination will also be applied to representation. So it's going on. There is a distinction. We make this distinction in order to avoid the conclusion about all the representation, just taking the bad cases. So that's what I think that is the context at the end of the day. Trying to defend the realism of both the veil of perception objection of behind the pictorial, but at the same time, try to make this distinction to avoid take the imagination as a case that can be expressed as all the cases. That's what I think is the concept.
Very much.
Well, I lost kind of my number two. Thank you. I find it very interesting indeed, and liked it very much. One thing I was going to ask a bit about T3. So I like the way you were sort of thinking about how one could think of how Chrysippus he could at least construct a response to the challenge. Based on what he says, although you were being quite cautious about whether he would actually think of those kinds himself. I wasn't always. I'm saying this with a bit of caution because I don't know the passage at all well, but I wasn't entirely convinced by the way you reconstructed the argument. Just to say where on a quick reading of it, I had a slightly different impression. My impression was that there are sort of two theses in T3. The thesis number one being the one at the very beginning, that we are whitened and sweetened. It is possible to say without deceit and truly and firmly irrefutably, but that what produces the affection of white or sweetened is not possible to assert. So that's kind of an epistemological thesis or a thesis about what you should assert. And then the other thesis is the denial of direct realism, which I think comes towards I think it comes like 5 lines from the bottom. And so too it is most reasonable to hold that we are not able to grasp anything more than our own affections. And then in terms of the structure, so I think those are sort of 2 independent theses. Or if said you could reject one or the other, you could accept one or the other, you don't need to accept them both. And the arguments in the first half of the passage looks to me like an argument for the first thesis. And then the argument for the second thesis, the argument for denying direct realism, I'm not really sure what it is, but it might just be, it's most reasonable to deny direct realism because affections reveal nothing more than themselves. So I'm not really, I'm saying this tentatively because I don't know that, and I know this is only part of that passage, right? So I might have misunderstood it. But in any rate, I do think it sort of reveals that there might be more to be said about some of these things, because of course those two are independent. And the Cyrenaics could say, well, okay, we don't really care. Okay, go with your form of disjunctivist direct realism if you want, but still our epistemological thesis stands. And it stands because, yes, in cases of genuine perception, you are perceiving the object directly, but you can't tell the difference between those cases and cases of illusion. So it's not safe for you to talk about the thing which produces the affection. So you could accept this kind of disjunctivist direct realism and still think that the important thesis at the beginning of the passage still stands. So there I'm thinking that therefore, and this goes back to the discussion you had earlier, it might be that actually it's really something like the difference between cognitive and non-cognitive impressions that's really important for answering that challenge in the first part of the passage. And my other remark on that line was that actually, although, because you were saying that you think that the argument relies on the assumption that illusion and impression or representation have a common genesis. I mean, it also strikes me though that the actual examples they use to motivate their argument aren't actually cases of illusion. Or is there not cases where there's no object there at all? So it's not cases like when you're arrested as hallucinating theories. Rather, it's cases where there is something there that you miss it. Right? The person that drawn this is actually affected by an external object, but the representation is accurate. So it isn't actually, that was another respect which I wasn't really sure. It seems to me that there is the distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive impressions that would actually be brought in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wasn't aware of making distinctions, so it really helped. Yes, as I said at some point, all the ontological problem is intertwined with the epistemological concept. At least in this text, the epistemological concept that I have already to mention here is what are the things that we can know, like, as I'm saying, the test, phenomena are removed, like knowledge. The context of this text is in the discussion of how can we obtain knowledge, valuable knowledge. And the Cyrenaics are trying to understand that we can only have knowledge of our own action. We can have knowledge of the external world. This is the epistemological. But I think that in order to do this view, this epistemological view, the Cyrenaics rely on the ontological problem. That was basically what I think that is going on, that why the epistemological issues are related with these other ontological problems. So yes, I agree. There are like two arguments here. Now, regarding your second question, that's one of the reasons I doubt that Chrysippus text is a direct response of this text. That's why I have some doubt. That's why I'm now saying that, well, this is exactly the argument that Chrysippus is resisting in his text, because as you said, this is a case in which we have an external object that is represented incorrectly. But in the Chrysippus, we have a case when we have no object. So what I think, one hypothesis is that they are not directly engaged, but they are just making emphasis in the more important cases. So just because in the case of the Cyrenaics, for his argument is strong, they want to rely on those cases in which you really have an object, but you have to say, we are not directly aware of that object. And I think that in the Stoic case, in Chrysippus, he has a different emphasis because he's trying to show that we can be aware of things, even if they are not causally interactive with us. That's why I don't think there is a direct response, exactly a direct response, especially because it's not clear what would be a Stoic position in that distinction between those cases of when you have a external object, but you don't represent it correctly. My hypothesis is that, at least as the distinction is drawing in Chrysippus' text, those illusions must be cases of representation. You have an external object, but you are attributing, your representation is attributing to that object different properties that are incorrect. But I think that even in that case, he's trying, and the Chrysippus argument like blocks this so just the generalizing inference, at least. I'm not quite sure exactly how the Stoic would be the exact response to this exact problem, but at least he's blocking the generalizing inference. He's allowing this movement that he's doing by this. So it is more reasonable, or he's blocking that at least.
Thank you very much. We still have 2 questions left, but we only have 6 minutes left. So please be very brief. Luca,
the question that also very small point as a note to your answer to Ricardo's question. I think that the way in which Chrysippus' rejection of a certain reading of the works of imagery works, there is more work that it would need to be done to say, well, that shows that he rejects pictorialism. Because when you look at the arguments, actually what is being rejected, the reasons why Chrysippus rejects it have nothing to do with pictorialism. So, for example, the argument is not how can you have pictorial representations of sounds or pictorial abstract objects. The objection is you will have too many imprints in a physical space which is limited and they will sort of superimpose one over the other. How could you have 2 impressions at the same time in mind? Because again, they blur together. So those kind of arguments I don't think talk about the literal meaning of the works imagery as a rejection of its pictorial or potential pictorial kind of import, but seem to tackle different problems. And the question in a way is something that has been raised already at least 3 times. So I don't know whether you want to say anything more about it, but I will just rephrase the way in which I have a concern about this disjunctivism and the way in which you have these 2 models by which fantasy is something which is caused by the object, and as the object posing it as it's what you call the intentional object. Whereas then you have imagination in which the cause is something going on in your mind, and therefore the cause differs from the intentional. I wonder whether this elides very important kind of nuances and distinction, starting from the fact that for the Stoics, the cause of the impression is the mind. In all cases, is the mind that imprints or otherwise the impression as the result of something, of course, that is happening But to say that in one case it's the mind causing the impression, in another case that is the external object causing the impression, that is not the picture. The impression is created in accordance with external object by the mind. And my problem was exactly, and I don't know whether it's a problem for your interpretation or for Resipus, or at least that single text which wants to make this distinction about this gray area concerning false impressions, which are coming from something that is there, but represented correctly. And I think that on your picture, you have this all or nothing thing by which the hallucination is something which comes from nothing, just from something internal, and therefore there is this discrepancy between object and cause, and then proper fantasy. Like I think it's quite difficult. It seems to be more on the spectrum there. So you might have two cases of someone who has nothing in front of their eyes and sees the Furies, and someone who has an electron in front of their eyes and sees the Furies. Would you say that that is, and then you have the case of someone who sees Socrates and thinks sees Plato. Would you say that the case of someone who has electron in front and sees the Furies is more like the case of a simple case of this perception of a human being for another human being? Or is the hallucination which there is absolutely nothing in front of you, but actually there is air in the background, there are physical objects with colors and shape, anyway there is something that you have to do anyway. So I was wondering whether that distinction you're trying to do quite a lot of work, very interesting work, the way in which you want to explain basically own general position about direct realism, but is one which has in itself some problems and perhaps anyway needs to be nuanced in the way which is described. Questions about what is the content or intentional object, what is the cause of the impression. I think the answer to these questions are less clear cut than the presentation.
Regarding the first question about the realities, yes, I think that as Leonardo told me before, I think that my problem could be that I'm relying too much on Sextus Empiricus understanding of this point during his process. My assumption was like he's really rejecting this pictorial conception. So the only story that seems to have something similar to that is Cleante. But of course, as you said, might be a case that Cleante has a not clear position that Quasipul wanted to correct in some respects to avoid this problem.
Whether the arguments are targeted or aspect.
Regarding the second question, yes, the main problem is what is called illusion, right? Because hallucinations, and this is clear, we have no external object, so we need an account of this. But then you have those cases which are those of illusion in which you have an external object actually interacting with your soul, but the object will be.
And that's why I say that the cause of the impression is always the mind is important. Because if you see electron as a Fury, it's because you have a concept of a Fury in your mind, and somehow it gets applied. So if that still counts as simply as misperception, that is a case in which you could say there is a sense in which something of that caused your impression, but causing is very, well, for the Stoics, there are often multiple causes for something happening. That will when we form an impression. The external object is only part of the process.
I haven't thought about that possibility because, as you said, there are like umbrella of cases from you looking at these pages and seeing a theory as just seeing someone with black hair looking with red hair. That's the second case that was made me think that here in those cases the object, the object that appears forward. Like, but yeah, I even thought that one possibility is to take into account that the minds has some contribution, which could explain why in those cases the illusions are cases in which that external object partially constituting the content of the representation, but also the mind, which is like making the wrong apply the right identification of the object. So really helps. Thank you.
Yeah, please, very brief. We all
Yes,
very
thanks a lot. Yes, thanks for the very interesting presentation, Christian. I just wanted to say that I feel a bit uncomfortable when you put the point in terms of an ontological question about the objects of perception, right? Because, I mean, metaphysical disjunctivism, it's to say in several places, that question is a thesis about experience, right, or perceptual experience. They say that veridical perceptual experiences are of a different kind from non-veridical perceptual experiences, illusions, error, state, kind of hallucination. So, but when you put it in terms of the objects of perception, it's a bit misleading, right? Because, in a sense, the objects of perception are just external objects for physical, right? They're just external objects. There are no other things that are perceived, right? So the difference in the experiences are rather a difference about content, not about object, right? Like some metaphysical duties say that. The difference is a difference of intentional content. Others say that it's about phenomenal character, for example, which, I mean, physicists may say that. But, I mean, I say it especially in respect to P5, when there is a talk about phantasm. It seems that phantasm are rather part of the content rather than the object of perception, right? In this example, because it is said that Orestes says this is a madman and he sees nothing. So, I mean, there is no object of perception. So phantasm is part of the content rather than the object. So I think it would perhaps help to solve some of the worries to put the point in terms of just this is about perceptual experiences and their content rather than about objects of perception.
One question that I have about your question is, how do you understand this difference between object and content? Why do they say? I mean, why do you understand?
Because the content of Orestes' perceptual experience is poorly, right? I mean, this is that's the content, but it's not the object of perception. Yeah. And so when you see, when I look at Lucas and I see Luca and I see Ricardo, the content is Ricardo. So that's the difference. And then you make the difference of different kinds of content. Those that correspond to veridical perceptual experience, those correspond to veridical.
I'm not quite sure, to be honest, about this difference, object and content, because what I think is that one way to put the distinction is that the content of their representations is object evolving, so to speak, that the present object is part of the content, the external object, at least or partially constitute the content in some way, which is not the case in the other imagination.
But that's well, you can say that there's a difference. That one content is dependent on an object, the other not. So to say that it is part of the concept, I don't know. We'll have to talk more about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Christian, thank you.
You can leave.
You think
If you want, you can leave. One is other. One is
I was, yeah. Well, I feel like reviewing is a success.